It's actually a great segue to one of the main issues that we are fighting for, which is universal basic income. You have universal basic income, you have living wage, you have Medicare for all, and obviously a Green New Deal or some modifications to that end. But and then of course ending the wars. But that you would say is probably like our progressive Pentagon.
I would say that our basically, we believe that human beings have a basic standard of dignity of life that they are entitled to.
Yes.
And that as a civilization, that we need to have what we consider to be our baseline of existence, and that we need to do whatever we can to get people to that baseline. And so to me, I've always looked at UBI as a tool for that. I know that there's a lot of criticism regarding that from the left in terms of, is that just, a way to get rid of other sort of, entitlements that they call entitlements. But to me, it's a tool. And right now, I think we could really use that tool.
And that in itself is why having Pelosi again as speaker is so detrimental, because, she's not going to be fighting for universal basic income in any capacity. But what we do have are a number of people in the progressive movement, led, of course, by Andrew Yang, who is running for a mayor of New York City, who I think is going to shine an even brighter light on this immense need right now. And we are obviously very pleased to bring in our guest, Scott Santens. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And, obviously a lot of people, I think right now, after yesterday, are looking for alternative ways to build this movement outside of electoral politics. And I think universal basic income, in lieu of everything that's been going on, really has to take an even bigger spotlight. It needs to have a bigger light on it that it didn't have previously, because the evictions problems, obviously people not being able to work right now, COVID is not getting better. And obviously, if you see what's going on here in Florida, they are completely bungling the process of getting people their vaccines. So with that said, please introduce yourselves. Tell everybody about, what your background is. It seems that you had.
I was going to say, take a breath.
Yeah, I know.
Take a breath. I was going to say, hi, Scott. I'm Jen. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Jen. It's nice to meet you, too.
How's it going?
Good. I'm here in New Orleans.
Are you from there, or are you just there now?
I've been living here since 2009, so it's the longest place I've ever lived in.
That's cool. So, but why don't you do a brief introduction, like who you are, what your, skill set is, and, why you're here.
Yeah. So I got into the idea of basic income back in 2013, and this was really before there was any much discussion. And it was even before discussion of basically the effects of automation was going on, because that didn't really happen until the Oxford report came out in later 2013. But I came in through that angle of thinking about the future, and just the fact that people weren't talking about automation and what that meant and what we should do as a result of that. How do you actually make automation work for all of us instead of actually leaving a lot of people worse off, and only some people, much wealthier. And that idea brought me to basic income, and I wasn't really familiar with it. So, I dove into the history. I learned that, how close we were, that Nixon had proposed a version as guaranteed income back in the 70s. I didn't know about the experiments that had taken place across the US about that, or any of the experiments in Canada, or any of the experiments elsewhere around the world since then. So I was just fascinated learning about all of that. And also just about, learning about the way that our existing safety nets work. I had made all sorts of assumptions about how the safety net worked, and really learning more about that really just drove it home even more about how important this is, not just as a automation kind of future kind of thing, but as this is something we really need right now, and we should have done it decades ago, if not centuries ago. And I crowdfunded my own basic income actually starting in 2016. So I've been living with this feeling of economic security for years now. And, having this monthly floor enables me to, focus on what it is that I feel that I should be focusing on. I can focus on the writing that I want to do. I can focus on podcasting. I can focus on really just whatever I feel is most important. And it allows me to do that. And I don't have to worry about coming up with, money for the basics, because that is something I can count on every month. And that feeling of economic security is really something that it's hard to describe to people who don't have that feeling. Like you don't know how security really feels like until you feel it.
So what do you, when you say you did a crowdsourcing, like for yours, I mean, what's your background there? I mean, do you have an economics background? Like where did, you know, when you first got into this, what were you doing?
Yeah, so my background is really just as a self-employed, you know, entrepreneur. You know, let's say I tasted the freelance market, you know, my whole adult life. So, you know, I didn't have any kind of even healthcare until Obamacare, you know, happened. And so, you know, it's like I've been living this feeling of being outside the safety net for my entire adult life. So I think that's probably also why it made sense to me as well. But yeah, my background is actually psychology. That was what I got my degree in. And that's also why basic income appeals to me from like a human behavioral perspective. Like, how is it that people behave? How does it change the way that we think and react and treat each other once we have economic security? Like that really interests me.
I mean, I know that you're probably aware that one of the biggest criticisms of UBI is that, well, then people aren't going to want to work. You know, everyone is just going to sit around and just be unproductive and just live on their, you know, $1,200 a month or whatever it is. And I know that to be ridiculous, but that is one of those things that people say. And I'm curious if you have been able to sort of like in any way quantify what you're talking about in terms of your ability to really be productive and serve in your best capacity and have the freedom to do that when you have a certain amount of security. Like the levels of entrepreneurship, the levels of business opportunities for people to take are massive when they have a safety net. But how does those positives, is there a way to show that versus now people are just going to decide to not work?
Yeah, you know, there's just so much around this discussion of work, and it certainly is one of the biggest responses to it. And it's funny because it's like we never ask about, you know, oh my gosh, what happens if people inherit money from their rich parents? What are they going to work? What do we do about all these?
We should worry about that because a lot of those kids and the trust fund kids are obnoxious and they actually should be working. So, you know, maybe we should start that discussion.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, we know that if we look at like entrepreneurs, that those who actually become entrepreneurs are most likely those who had money. And like, if you come from money, you are far more likely to do that. And so it's like, are they special? Are they born with some kind of entrepreneur gene? Well, of course not. They're just born and they have more resources. So they're able to use those resources. Yeah. It's like so many people have ideas that they want to do, but they're prevented from those ideas and they have to, you know, go into the labor market. And because they don't have a basic income, they have to accept whatever wage is on offer, no matter how low it is, because low is better than nothing. But when it comes to the data, like it's really been well researched because it is the thing that we care most about is seemingly. And so like in the 70s, when we did those experiments, that was the only thing we looked at. So it was unfortunate that we didn't take that opportunity to even look at, you know, effects on health, effects on trust, and effects on, you know, all these other things we can look at and have looked at since. But then we only looked at work. And what we did find is that really the biggest impact is that mothers of newborns actually essentially use it as paid maternity leave. So they were able to stay home instead of going back to work sooner and care for their kids. And the other big effect too was that students were able to drop out of the labor market, and you know, they didn't just stay home and do nothing. What they did is they went to school. So you actually had dropouts going back to high school and finishing and getting their degrees. You had students who had graduated from high school who went to college because they had that ability, whereas before they would have had to work in order to get income for the household. So those were the two biggest impacts of the work reductions. And it's like, you know, those aren't work reductions. Those are shifting work to a different form. And of course, it's not, you know, the only work is not paid work that we know is employment. There's lots of other kinds of work too. And two of them are being a student and being a mom and a care worker. Yeah.
I mean, well, we know that in this country, we don't value that as work. That's something when I hear things like that, I automatically start thinking about like Scandinavia and the entire paradigm shift of what if you actually valued people for what they want to contribute and what they contribute in their best way? Like, what if we did that? But we prefer to keep people as drones and just working into a system that they can't afford to live in. It's just, it's easier that way to keep everybody in line. That's what I think.
Yeah.
I think it's easier to keep everyone in line.
Yeah, no, it really, there's this, if someone were to ask me, why don't we have basic income, even though like we've had all the experiments, even though like we know that it works well, you know, why we don't have it, I really think it's a power issue. It's a, like one of the best kind of summaries was actually from the chair of the Senate Finance Committee that prevented guaranteed income from passing through the Senate, even though it was passed through the House twice back under Nixon. And his question was, who will press my shirts? And so, you know, this is like, if you guaranteed income to people, especially in the South, then how is he going to get the work done at the price he wants to pay if people don't have to be coerced to do it for low pay? Like, it's really a mechanism of maintaining a, you know, slave labor of wage slavery market for people. Yeah.
So, I mean, in the ideal world, how would that look here? What would UBI, like in a practical sense, what would it look like here? And is there any means testing involved? And, you know, how would that work?
Yeah. So just to get into the definition too of UBI, the elements that make up a UBI are that it's fully universal. So it goes to rich and poor, like it's unconditional. So there's no work requirements attached. You can use it for anything that you want to. And it goes to each individual. It's not targeted to the household. It goes to each member of the household. And it's regularly provided as cash. So those are what make up UBI. And I think each of those elements are very important to a successful optimal UBI. So when he asks, what do I see as being, you know, the way of going about this? It needs to be fully universal. You know, you can't draw a distinction between rich and poor. If you want to claw back from the rich, the best way to do that is through the tax code and by increasing their taxes so that they are not net recipients of the $12,000. So, you know, just like with the stimulus checks that we saw, it was unfortunate.
We give it to them, but we just take it back from them.
Yeah, yeah. Like, we shouldn't have drawn a line at $75,000 and said those below get the full 2,000 and those above get less until you get 99,000. You get nothing. We should have just said, okay, if you want to draw a line at 75,000, then let's make sure everyone gets that money now. And then next year when we do taxes, there can be a surtax on income earned in 2020 so that you retroactively pay that clawback back. That's how you create the clawback system, because then you don't exclude anyone that you would otherwise exclude.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. And you know, the other thing that I have heard often as criticism is that, does this take away from the incentive to get things like Medicare for all and a living wage? And I've always been a supporter of UBI as, you know, a tool, but not in, you know, that would have to work in conjunction with to meet universal health care. In order for it to really, and we do need a living wage. Like, I just think that those things have to happen simultaneously.
Yeah, I see it as a floor, and I consistently emphasize that essentially we have a missing floor. So it's like, imagine that there was a house that we built on just a dirt foundation. Like, we didn't bother adding concrete, and we didn't bother like creating like a really firm foundation. Instead, we just built a house on top of dirt. And now there's like cracks in the house, windows are falling out, you know, it's crumbling. And we did that because we built on top of something that wasn't firm. So we have to make sure that there's this foundation underneath it all, so that, you know, everyone always has at least, you know, this amount of money that they can count on, that they know is always going to be there. Because then you not only have that access to resources, so it's like you have that ability to buy food, but also you have that security and that knowing that that's going to be there. So that stability is also very important. And also you've reduced inequality by having that foundation too, which is also really important. Even aside from the fact that having the resources and knowing the resources are going to be there. So all those three elements are very important. And then the stuff you build on top of it makes more sense. So right now we have healthcare. And let's say we only did universal healthcare right now. Well, okay, you do that and that's good. but then also you're treating so many things downstream that you could have prevented upstream by just having those resources and having that security. Yeah, yeah. And, you know, so much disease is caused by high stress, chronic stress, you know, diabetes, even, you know, cancer, heart disease. Like a lot of these things are essentially to some degree the result of not having unconditional economic security. And so we could, once you have healthcare on top of that, we're going to be spending less on that. And that's good because we have a healthier population. We want that. And the same thing with education. Like, I definitely think that we need a strong public education system, public college on top of this as well. And then what you do is you'll have better outcomes. So just like we've seen this in experiments too, where kids who their parents receive basic income, they do better in school. They go further. They actually do more post-secondary learning. And so, you know, it's like a kid who goes to school on an empty stomach. Sure, it's great that you're providing them public education, but if they're unable to focus on what they're learning, you know, they walk out of there, let's say they get C's or D's, or maybe they don't even pass and they flunk if they do a grade over again. But if they would have had, if their parents would have had economic security, they could have gotten, you know, A's and B's, and they would be learning so much better and so much more and be more successful in their careers and just in life, having that better education. So that's this, there's a missing component. It needs to be there.
Yeah, it's funny. No, I was just going to say, we work with an organization down here called Mobile School Pantry, and their one of their mantras is full tummies fuel minds.
Yeah.
And it is true. And the kids who end up sort of labeled and disadvantaged from the beginning, just once you hit that path, that's it. That's it. You're down that road. You are that kid. And it's just, yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
Do you have a good question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Scott, I think the thing about Andrew and what made him so successful is that he really captured the wonky politicos with a great idea. Much like Bernie was able to capture the nation with Medicare for all, Andrew's UBI was really what defined him, and it was smart. He had a plethora of things if you looked at his website, but he hammered that idea and made sure to repeat it over and over again. What is it going to take to make UBI palatable to the MSNBC, CNN, even Fox News crowd, if you will? I personally look at it as just calling it Social Security for all, but maybe you have a better idea that might work in terms of bringing more people into the fold.
Or what's worked in other places that is, you know, an easier sell to the more libertarian crowd.
Yeah. So there isn't like one, like, say, most popular way that works with everyone. I think Social Security for all is certainly a way of reaching certain groups of people and explaining that, hey, you know, all this is just, say, Social Security for dropping the age down from 65 to say 18 or something.
Yeah.
Like, that is a helpful way of understanding what this is. But also, Andrew said often that he did do some testing and he found that, you know, freedom dividend worked well because, you know, he's aiming for universality. A dividend works well to understand why everyone should receive it. You know, so that it did the job. But also, I think there's other ways. I prefer referring to it as unconditional basic income because I do that personally because unconditional, I think, is the most important element of the elements I described of what it is. And I feel that personally, as having a crowdfunded basic income, that unconditional is important. But also, I see that over and over again from pilots. I've seen this in the Finland experiment showed this, Namibia, India, like there's always someone who, if you ask them what's most important now that you've like experienced this, and they describe the unconditionality, like they didn't have to do anything for it. They didn't have to prove anything. It was just there. And once you know something is there, and that's it. I think that's just really important. So I stress that. But also, if you're going to reach conservatives, I think that they need to understand it as like a big national monthly tax rebate, or a refund or a credit.
Then you have to talk in taxation terms. They like everything in fiscal taxation terms, and they need to know that somehow they are not personally paying for someone else. Like they need to see it in a Yeah.
Which, to the credit of the conservative side, they tend to be very policy oriented. I'm not talking about necessarily the elected GOP per se, but in terms of the actual voting blocks, policy is a very important thing. And anytime you can show somebody how it benefits them in their wallet, that's usually how you get their attention.
Yeah, and it's individuals, if they can understand that they get something. And so again, that's where the universality comes from in the importance, is that you have to assume that you're going to be a net beneficiary of this. And if you assume that you are just going to be paying higher taxes for it, then you're more likely to be like, well, I don't want that. But if you're like, well, I'm included, I get this too, then you're more likely to support it. And then that's why universal programs are just more supported in general. Social Security is a strong program because everyone thinks, well, when I reach that age, I will get it too. It's not only for them. It's also, I think, why the Alaska dividend has been so popular for so many years. I mean, everyone in Alaska has received a UBI since 1982. And I don't think it would have been as popular if they had decided back in 1982 to say, oh, it only goes to those earning under $75,000 the previous year.
Well, I love the way they premised it there. The premise of it is that it's based on them getting a dividend from their joint property and what they own in terms of the resources. And I think that's the way that we frame it in terms of, this is our combined resources of this country that we all should be sharing in. And let's face it, we don't. The pipelines that are going through are poisoning our water sources. We're not getting any sort of dividend from those profits of the oil that's being put through our land. So I think if we look at it like, dividend, we're investors in and that should be, or we should be getting dividends on that. I think that's a smart way to do it.
Yeah. Another thing too about Alaska is, they see it as a right. It's their right, it's their ownership right. And they also see it as essentially their natural inheritance. And that goes back to Thomas Paine's argument of natural inheritance, where he described that, everyone upon reaching the age of 21 should receive the same capital grant as everybody else. And he saw that his reasoning for it was, well, okay, we created civilization through private property. And in doing so, we actually made some people worse off at the same time as making a lot of people better off. And so if you're going to actually prohibit access to the land, then you actually have to compensate people for that loss of access. So we were all the dispossessed of our natural inheritance. And that's where he saw it as a right and not charity. So I think that it's important that we too see it that way. It's just as true that we, can't live off the land. We can't just find some spot and just do work on our own and survive. We are prohibited from doing that. So as long as we're prohibited, then we should actually see it as a right to that survival income as being a right that has been taken from us. And also, it not only is a natural inheritance right, but again, we should see it as a technological inheritance right too. This is, all of humanity is just building up of generation after generation upon the previous generations. And we're very fortunate that we're born in this time right now when all this technology exists as it is. And it doesn't make any sense for someone to just, be born now and become a multi-billionaire,
right?
As if they could have done that 100 years ago. They couldn't have done that. The technology didn't exist. So we should see it as humanity goes forward, then we should always have some sharing of that, previous body of knowledge that only existed thanks to those ancestors. And going forward, it just makes more and more sense to have that technological inheritance, as the dividend, especially as we're the ones also creating all the data that together even makes it more technology possible that would otherwise be not possible.
I think Andrew running for mayor in New York right now couldn't have come at a better time, considering all of Cuomo has completely botched. You want to talk about DeSantis down here in Florida. Cuomo has completely botched handling COVID. It is spreading again like crazy, and evictions are, ramping up in New York. UBI would be a game changer potentially for hundreds of thousands of people in New York City. And if you could speak to that, because, unfortunately, Andrew's the only one who really is a known commodity right now who is pushing UBI, but New York City is probably as good a place as any, considering the wealth gap that exists. I'm from New Jersey. I know it well. So if you could speak more to that, I think that'd be very, very important.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see just how Yang runs the campaign there, and how people react to that. There's definitely a different New York now than there was, like, let's say if Yang had run last year. And suddenly so many people, like you said, they're facing eviction.
Post
They've experienced
New
food
York.
bank lines. Yeah. And not only that, but they've experienced our safety net for what it is. They've applied for unemployment for the first time. They've discovered that you have to maybe call back for 2 weeks. It may have required that, maybe you actually uh get like through the process, but then like you were waiting months and you still haven't gotten your first check. Like there's over a million people right now in America who have been unemployed this entire time since March, and have been, waiting since March for their first unemployment check, and they still haven't gotten it. So in New York, there's a lot of people who've experienced all of this for the first time. And I think they're very open in a way that they weren't before to hearing about, oh, I can actually just rely on, say, $1,000 per month going forward. Like that would just change everything. And also, like, there's certainly some really interesting funding opportunities to, or say, how to apply taxation in New York in a way that could work really well. And I don't know what Andrew's thinking in regards to just what he's going to announce, and if it's going to be, say, a pilot, or even like an actual program for basic income in New York. I don't know, but it is interesting to consider the various means that New York makes possible that maybe be more difficult elsewhere. So let's say, a land value tax, I think would be really interesting to see in New York City, because there's just immense land value that is even, it's being treated as investments from people overseas. And, where is the tax money for that? How is it that all this public infrastructure and all these investments going in benefit the owners of land instead of, renters? Like, that's another thing about traditional taxation in infrastructure, is that whenever you do that, you're actually kind of hurting renters, because you're going to have the prices go up, and the owners of the property are going to be the windfall beneficiaries. So if you apply a land value tax, which is taxed on the unimproved value of land, so they're not taxed on the buildings or the skyscrapers, they're taxed on the actual value of the land itself, and you do that, on a monthly basis or whatever, then you can actually really make sure that everyone in New York benefits from this vast wealth inequality in New York.
Yeah, it's getting dividends off the land in your collective city. And I think that, this is, a lot of times I find it's very frustrating because everybody is so concerned with their rights and nobody's concerned with their responsibilities. And I just think that, people have to realize that we are only better off with a healthy and educated population around us, and that we're not going to have that when our minimum security level is living in the street. Like that's just not going to work in our best interest. And COVID is that's just exacerbating a situation that was already, I think, pathetic. So, I mean, I think if anything, it offers us an opportunity, like what you were saying, to say this is an opportunity for this to really work.
Yeah, and another thing too that first of all, I was happy to see it, and also I was very frustrated to see the response to the visible evidence. But the fact that we provided a $1,200 stimulus check back, in April, and that we also did a $600 per week boost to unemployment insurance. That was $2,400 per month for people who were qualified and who got that, and also through pandemic unemployment assistance. That was for a new program for gig workers, which was interesting because here we'd ignored them the entire time as being included from the safety net, and suddenly we're like, oh, let's go ahead and get money to them too. It's like, well, great, but like you were ignoring them before. But anyways, all this money, this boost went up to the point where 2 out of 3 of the unemployed were actually seeing an increase in their income, even after they are unemployed. And so you had conservatives who were like, oh, that's wrong. We're paying people not to work. They're not going back to work, blah, blah, blah. The evidence showed that it didn't have that effect, that there was no work disincentive, even with a $2,400 per month boost, that there was no work disincentive. But also that amount of income boosted consumption. And therefore, it created jobs and it prevented jobs from being lost that otherwise would have been lost. And so I want, and I was upset with the fact that Republicans didn't use that. They didn't say, hey, this is we need to make sure that there are customers. We need to make sure that people have money to be customers.
So I say it all the time.
They talk about small business and how they love small business and how important small businesses are. Well, if you really do feel that way, then you have to make sure that there's businesses have customers and that those customers have money to spend. And so that's something that I think that this situation and the pandemic really leads into, is that, look, if we want to, even after the vaccine is out there and it's distributed and we consider this kind of over, we still have a recession to get out of that's going to be around for a while unless we invest in the spending that makes it possible to grow out of it. And so that's why you have economists saying, look, we need to spend at least $5 trillion in the next 2 years in order to actually accelerate out of this recession, or else we're going to be, essentially losing that money. So we have to spend that much in order to avoid losing more than that. And so, that's what UBI is. It enables people to spend to the economy, that grows the economy. And we have this, what Yang referred to as a trickle up economy. I like to say it's grow up economics, because it's time for economics to grow up, and that we need to make sure that people have that spending. And that's also, anecdotes are so powerful. So I just want to share this real quick anecdote from the Namibia UBI pilot. And so there was a woman there who was very successful, who was the most successful example. The first thing that she did with her first payment was she went out and she got flour, she got yeast, and she made a little makeshift oven, and she started baking these small baked goods for her village. And she succeeded to the point where she earned so much more money on top of her basic income from her new business. And so people will look at that and go, oh, how great it is that she did that. Well, imagine if she'd only gotten a loan. So she would have done the exact same thing, but who would have bought her stuff? No one in her village could have really been able to afford it. The reason she was successful was because she was in a village that had UBI. So then everyone in her village had the money, and they all, wanted her bread, and they were able to pay for her bread. So that's really the thing, is it's not only about making sure that capital gets to the hands of people who want to start businesses and open them, but if we want them to succeed, we have to make sure that they exist in an environment where people have money to spend.
Yeah, I mean, we're at that point where capitalism is imploding on itself. And I think that, people look back at FDR and think, oh, that's socialism, when in fact he was an aristocrat that was saving capitalism from imploding on itself, because you can't build moats wide enough. And at some point, that's what's going to have to happen. I mean, the people can only be hungry for so long before they're going to, I just think it's going to get really ugly.
Yeah, I think we got a taste of that. Just looking at what happened with Larry Summers recently, when he spoke down from his ivory tower saying that $2,000 was a bad idea because you would just be going to people who couldn't spend it.
I don't think that's the warning shot. I think the warning shot is what happened at Pelosi's house the other day.
Oh, did you see that?
Oh yeah. That's a great example too. Yeah.
If they think if they think people are fooling around, they're lucky that's all that was. Because
I just feel bad for the pig. There was a pig.
Yeah, so that was interesting about that example too. Is someone actually painted UBI on the garage as well?
That's
awesome. I'm hesitant to believe that was actually, say a progressive or someone on the left who did that, just because of the choice of words that they used. And it's we want everything, and you have the anarchy symbol with the A perfectly in the circle. We don't know who did this. But at the same time, the fact is that was a response that both Mitch and Pelosi got essentially warnings, saying, look, we are really pissed off and we know where you live. That's a scary thing. It's a scary reminder, but it's true. And if these people are going to, prevent their constituents from living their lives and actually increasing death and stuff, but there's going to be reactions far worse than that.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been amazed that this doesn't happen more. I don't understand. how do these people get a moment's peace in their life? Like, I don't understand how that happens. I think they should have people like protesting in front of them when they come out of their house, when they go to their work. I don't understand how they get a moment's peace.
Yeah, it's interesting discussion as far as like, you know, that happened a few times. Just even the last couple of years, you know, where we went through that. Oh, how dare you approach someone in a restaurant? And, you know, you just don't do that. And it's like, well, I mean, if they're a public figure and they're, you know, a public servant and they're supposed to be listening to people, I just think that it should be there. Like, they should want to do what their constituents are pressuring them to do so that they aren't bothered in these kinds of ways and that they can live a life. Like, I can imagine, you know, someone like Katie Porter is out there worried about people going up to her because, you know, she's not actually being a representative for their interests. Like, she really represents people's interests and is someone I think people are proud of in her district.
Yeah.
And I think that if you want your peace and quiet, if you want to live your life in a normal way like the rest of us, you have to respond and actually be a representative. Yeah.
Do your job.
I do think that even though force the vote did not happen yesterday, that I think it does set precedent for what could happen in other places. We actually put out on social media that if you really want to force the vote, you should try that in California because they got pretty close once. And I would think if you keep doing that, it could happen. And I do think ideas like UBI can be done in conjunction with something like Medicare for All, because those are, we've been saying that Medicare for All and UBI are the two most pressing things that this country needs right now. Right now. And had we had Medicare for All and UBI, even if, you know, Trump had executive ordered it back in March, this pandemic would have been handled 10 times better than it is now, just by those two policies being implemented, because the people, especially the vulnerable people, I mean, we ended up losing, you know, a good friend in the progressive movement down here because he couldn't afford to stay home. He had to work and he ended up catching it and he ended up passing from it.
Well, that and the fact that they opened a COVID clinic, a makeshift COVID clinic in his office building, in interior corridors, sharing an elevator with a COVID clinic.
Oh, wow.
And if we had Medicare for All and normal healthcare options in this country, you wouldn't need a COVID clinic and just some business office.
Could you imagine that? I mean, we're living in a country
how we got COVID.
That should be the sign. It's just that, unfortunately, most people, not everybody, but most people who live comfortably do not care enough about others' plight. They just don't. Yeah. And you know, you can see that in a city like New Orleans, where there are people who live extremely well and people who live extremely impoverished. So it's been like that for decades. And I don't really, I mean, you could probably speak to it more so than we could, but I'm not seeing a lot of that necessarily changing. And I know that something like UBI could. And like I said, the argument that I've heard repeatedly about UBI is this idea that I don't want rich people getting it. Or it should, you know, it should be means tested. You know, they do things like that. I think you brought up the perfect solution, which is if it basically becomes a tax.
You get it on the back end.
Yeah. If
you take it on the back end.
My apologies for not having the technical term, but that to me is the answer. So like you said, if the cap's at 75,000, okay, great. You know, so even if somebody who's making $1 million a year gets that $1,000 a month, it's not like they're going to keep it anyway. So that to me, I think at this moment, could you speak to what it's like in a city like New Orleans right now? And is there sort of like a brewing, you know, like progressive uprising of sorts that's going on in your neck of the woods? Because Louisiana is a very, very red state, but it's a very working class state.
It's very poor.
Yes. So I'm curious as to how things are in your neck of the woods.
Well, you know, I can't say that there's any kind of uprising, unfortunately. Like there was some protesting of Cedric Richmond because, you know, he wasn't really responding to the our environmental you know, corridor where, you know, people are affected by all the industry. And then, of course, the people who are most affected are the ones who are lower income. And, of course, that's mostly African Americans in around that area. So there was some protesting around that. And of course, now he's left his seat and he's part of the administration. But as far as New Orleans goes too, like I was able, I reached out to the mayor when the Mayors for Guaranteed Income initiative was started up, because I wanted to make sure that she knew about it and that she hopefully joined it, and she did. So the mayor of New Orleans joined the Mayors for Guaranteed Income, and I pitched a pilot, and we're working on that pilot, getting that started. Hopefully, it'll actually start up here in March is the goal. So at least you're seeing these pilots launching in various cities, and New Orleans is one of them. And I think that part of that is this growth in that increased interest is from the fact that we've experienced a year of COVID. We've experienced 2020, and just how many people are falling through these nets. So at least New Orleans is experiencing something from that perspective. But like in general, it's here. I think it's just the same as everywhere, where it's just unfortunate that we have this K-shaped economy that existed before COVID, and it certainly exists to a greater degree now, where a lot of people, like your Larry Summers, are in their own bubbles and they're thinking everything is fine, and they're looking at the various numbers and they're saying, hey, like a lot of people haven't seen income losses, so therefore it's mostly fine. And they're not experiencing how really not fine it is for millions and millions of Americans, and what that means for them specifically, but also for society at large. And I think even with the pandemic, we just didn't reach that point of there being, say, 50% unemployment, and what that means to entire society, and with so many people on the streets. Like we were able to get by and without like too much. Like we experienced the riots through the Black Lives Matter protests with George Floyd. And like I feel that was tied into, because there was already this kind of tinder for something like that to really catch fire, but it hasn't caught fire enough. And that's just something that we always need to be asking. As progressives, how do we actually get people into the streets? How do we actually get members of Congress to actually do what they need to do to feel that pressure? Because right now they don't. I mean, we have this system where they're able to be in their gerrymandered safe districts, and they don't care. Like they don't have to respond, and that's true for conservatives and progressives alike. Is as long as that gerrymandering exists, a problem.
How do we get a trial program here? How do we get what you're doing there here?
I think the Mayors for Guaranteed Income initiative really provides an opportunity for mayors to do this at the city level. And as I made a point on Twitter and today even, is just saying that any city can actually treat what they're doing from like a cash benchmarking perspective. So, when we were talking about, defund the police, we were talking about reallocation of funds so that, instead of spending money essentially downstream on criminality and policing, instead you're actually doing things that make more sense upstream, and avoiding all that, and making sure that, hey, if you're talking about mental health, let's actually get people mental health instead of treating that with like police. So any city can look at what they're doing, what programs are they doing, and say, let's actually, put some scientific method into this. Let's say we're doing this. Well, let's actually branch this off and say, let's just get people money unconditionally, and compare that to what we're doing and see what's different. So effectively, they did that in Vancouver recently. And by providing $7,500 as a cash grant to homeless people, that actually saved $8,100 on temporary shelter services per person as a result. So that should be a clear indication of, in that case, well, let's just get money to homeless people. Like we don't need to do this other thing that doesn't work as well, when we can actually get money to people and get them off the streets sooner and lead to better outcomes. Like, that's a housing first solution. And so, yeah, there's just so many different ways that we could look at what we're already doing and that can be a pilot in just showing that unconditional cash can be better than that.
Yeah, I'd love to figure out a way to do something like that here. I mean, Florida is not usually like the pioneer of all things progressive.
No, but I do think that Florida actually has the opportunity to become a very economic populist state. It's part of the reason why Trump is so popular here. And we always lamented the fact that Bernie never made a real effort in Florida.
No.
It was kind of mind-boggling.
They write it off. They always write off Florida and then act shocked that it's a red state.
But what's amazing is this is a state, as much as any, that is driven by the service industry. It's driven by working class people, especially Orlando, Tampa, and then of course you do have Southeast Florida that is very driven by the service industry. And the idea that there hasn't been that economic populist message that has really been driven home, I do think there are reasons for that. I think that the leadership within the Democratic Party in the state suppresses that significantly. I think they've been doing it for a very long time, but I think there is somewhat of an uprising that's happening now. And, somebody, like Jen obviously would advocate for that. And I do think it could happen. I do think in Florida, there are opportunities. I just think people they haven't really tried to do it. But like I said, I do think due to Trump's popularity, it has much more to do with the fact that he really appeals to the working class. And I do think that as long as you have an economic populist message, you can appeal to them. It's not as complicated as people make it out to be. And I think UBI is definitely an economic populist message. People have just been it's been ingrained in them that you're supposed to fight for survival rather than live somewhat of a decent existence.
And then they just label this as socialism and say you're going to be like Venezuela, or that's the problem.
Until someone like Trump says it's not socialism, and then suddenly a lot more people. Like, I loved how Lindsey Graham actually specifically said the other day, "Oh, come on, fellow conservatives, this isn't socialism." It's like, well, yeah, great, thank you, Lindsey, for saying the right thing. I know you only did it because Trump did it. You're a good boy, but that's still good. But yeah, I'm really interested to see what happens in Georgia tomorrow. I think that what happens can really do a lot for the basic income movement, because we know that $2,000 is being pushed hard by Ossoff and Warnock, and we know that Mitch prevented that from happening, and that there's if he loses, like if the entire Republican Senate suddenly becomes the Democratic Senate and it's on Mitch's shoulders because he prevented $2,000 from happening, then I feel that's a political game changer as far as just how much, say, momentum that has, because suddenly politicians all across the country are going to be really thinking about this differently. Like, they're going to be thinking, if I actually get more money to people directly, will I win? And will I lose if I am against that? And that's where you really get these machines of politics actually grind in a way in our favor, as soon as they feel that fear and that opportunity to win elections if they're for this. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully a flip Senate.
Mitch McConnell.
That's a great site. Well, that's what I was literally just going to ask. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow in Georgia? And I do think Warnock is clearly, the Reverend is the best candidate by far. I do not like Ossoff. I think he's Pete Buttigieg South, as I like to call him. But he's somebody who could ride the coattails of Warnock, because Perdue and Loeffler, especially Loeffler, they have absolutely no business being in the Senate.
Oh, she's just ridiculous. Ridiculous.
But I do think that the push for the $2,000 check alone moved the needle so much that even Loeffler and Perdue were starting to say, I think we need to give people $2,000 checks. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow, and what do you think needs to happen?
Yeah, so I was just looking at that data earlier today, where there's actually there's a 25-point difference as far as people being for or against the 2K as being, how they're going to vote. Like, that's a huge difference, as in so many Republicans there in Georgia really want that $2,000. So I do think that that's enough to do something. Now, I mean, we exist in a time where just, it's all tribal, extremely partisan, but maybe it's enough to like get that 1 points, 2 points that would have otherwise been the difference, because it's going to be a close race. It's going to be really close, but it is possible that this one issue was enough to put it over. And I hope that's the case. I mean, I'm not going to make any guesses because I just, the polling, I just don't trust it anymore. We just saw what happens when we put more faith in the polls and think that we know what's going to happen when we have no idea what's going to happen. Like we just don't know. I hope that there's been enough energizing, that there's been more newly registered voters, that, that there's going to be enough. Again, like this is a runoff too. And so, that already is more difficult than an actual, election day election. So, who knows? I just hope that Georgia flips blue, because getting rid of Mitch is just so important.
Wait, somebody has to do some sort of meme or graphic of the house landing on top of him and the munchkins coming out and singing. I mean, we just got it with like Debbie that it would be like ding dong.
Yeah, ding dong, the Mitch is dead. That's great.
Yeah, because he has, he enjoes being disliked at in a very sick, like he's
he has accepted that he is going to hell if hell is like he's accepted.
Couldn't care less. No. Well, no, he's like I'm not just going there. There's an office with my name on it.
Right. Yeah. No, he thinks that he'll be in power there.
Oh, I don't know.
He's got connections. I'm not convinced that he's not dead.
Because of his hand. The hand situation. Yeah.
Is like The Walking Dead. That's how I think he has no soul.
And this is the thing about strategy that people have to become a lot more. They have to recognize. They have to be able to adapt. I do think Charles Booker would have had an infinitely better opportunity to take out Mitch. I'm not saying he would have beat him, but having him on the ticket and having that populist message in Kentucky, as well as having somebody who could have helped a lot of other down ballot candidates, would have made a big difference. I do think whatever it takes to get Mitch out of power, you take it, just like Pelosi has to be taken out of power, even if that means, it's going to be 2 years from now. And now people have set the precedence of we're simply not going to put up with this crap anymore.
No.
I just hope right now there really is a populist uprising in the country. But I do think if it's going to happen, there's going to have to be an infinite amount of bridge building that is going to have to exist. One of the things that made Andrew so popular is that he really was a crossover candidate for somebody who was in some ways just running to get his name out there because, Bernie had invested all of his time building his name up and becoming like the primary candidate. And then, of course, we know what the Democratic establishment did to stop him. But Andrew, no question, a lot of his ideas and him himself is the future. And I think UBI is the future in many ways. So
Andrew builds coalitions and doesn't burn bridges. And it's just fascinating what intelligent people can come up with when they just decide to work together. It's so not that complicated.
And so, Scott, that's a perfect segue to the question that I want to ask you, because it seems to me that the economic message, or the plan, if you will, going forward is sort of this, I wouldn't call it a war, but I would just call it friendly competition between UBI and modern monetary theory. And we are going to have Steve Grumbaugh?
Yes, but I do not understand how those are apples and oranges. I don't understand what that thing has to do with the other.
I would love to hear your opinion about, is there really a difference between MMT and UBI, and can the two coexist, quite frankly?
I would say that MMT requires UBI to function best. I don't even consider them alternatives. Like MMT is essentially a funding mechanism, and UBI is a distribution mechanism.
I don't understand how these are completely they're totally, it's apples and oranges.
No, but Scott brings up you bring up a great point, which is MMT would function infinitely better with UBI.
Yeah, absolutely. Traditionally speaking, MMT advocates like to talk about how, you know, the federal job guarantee is their kind of anchor policy that really makes MMT work. And I just highly disagree with that as being, you know, this belief that, you know, first of all, it's ignoring all the unpaid work that's being done. It's ignoring intrinsic motivational incentives. It's ignoring, you know, all the people who, let's say, have to go through the qualification system of being, you know, fit or unfit to work. It ignores like all the existing work going on that's entirely unnecessary. And that if you guarantee work, then you don't enable people to stop doing unnecessary work. They still have to if there's no basic income. So I think that in order for all this to really function well, is you have to, again, have that foundation, that floor that this can exist upon. Because, you know, the best way of getting money to people for their survival needs is to just get it to them.
Just give them money.
Right. Don't like create jobs in order to be an excuse to get them that money. Just get it to them. And then you can have jobs in addition to that so that people can have higher incomes above that floor. And then by doing that, then suddenly, you know, all jobs are voluntary and suddenly all work becomes optional. Like, you don't want unpaid work to only be the privy of those who can afford it. You want to make sure that anybody can do that. You want to make sure that people can pursue their own passion projects that may not have any earnings whatsoever until, you know, years down the road. That you have to be able to enable that. And job guarantee doesn't do that. Nothing else does that. So you got to make sure they have that floor. And I like MMT as being a explanation of, you know, where money comes from, what taxation is. Like, there's a lot about it that I like. And I don't see it as anything different at all. In fact, I plan to write a big article too about MMT and UBI and how UBI can actually utilize MMT and how MMT needs UBI. So I will get into that in more detail on my own. But yeah, I totally believe that there's no issue there. And I wouldn't even say there's an issue with the job guarantee. You know, I would say that I would prefer that we should really focus on stuff getting done that we need to get done versus making sure people are employed. Like, yeah. I don't want us doing things that we don't necessarily be done or are done really inefficiently just because we feel that people need to be working in order for their lives to have some kind of value or dignity or worth or something. Like, I want us to be investing in like infrastructure that we really need. I want us to be investing in like real, like tangible task kind of goal completions. And then what's the best way of doing that? You know, so let's like build a bridge somewhere, but let's do it with as few people as possible, with as most machinery as possible, and get it done as quickly and best quality as possible. Instead of saying, well, we're building a bridge, so let's hire like 5,000 people because we can. Like, right. But I want to get away from that and more towards, you know, efficiency and making sure that people are doing what's important to them, that there's better skills matching, that we're utilizing intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation.
Yeah. I also was just thinking about how, you know, UBI works with something like the Green New Deal when we're talking about just transitioning our whole economy over into green energy. And there's always this concern about job loss. There's always this concern about job loss. And I maintain, just like I do for Medicare for All, that people that file papers can file papers in any industry. And for the most part, people's jobs can be transitioned for the most part. And that, yes, there's going to be some people that lose their jobs. And that's really sad. But maybe those people need to find something that they would much rather be doing. And UBI is what would offer them the ability to do that as a transition. And I think those things are really important together.
Yeah, I mean, so many people, again, are doing jobs not only that don't need to exist, but we don't want to exist. So, you know, there's like, let's say, you know, in the Appalachian, in coal country, like there's people still doing that job. And they're doing it because it's really like it's not only like a higher income job, but it's got like this community prestige also tied to the fact it's a higher income job. But it's something that we as a society should be getting away from. And what you cannot do is say, you need this job or you get $0, or you need this job or you get, say, disability income through SSI, in which case, if you're on that, then you have to stay unemployed in order to continue receiving it, because you can't earn income and still keep it. Like, we can't have this situation if we're trying to get away and evolve into a more sustainable system. So yeah, you have to, again, have that floor. And then you'll find that people are making better decisions, that they're, choosing jobs that make more sense for them, that they're creating jobs through their own entrepreneurial desires for an idea that they have. That, and again, they have customers. So many people in these coal country places, there's just almost a scarcity of money. And how are you supposed to create a thriving business, in this area where there's hardly any jobs, and what jobs there are coal jobs or whatever?
I think that was one major mistake that Paula Jean made when she ran for Senate in West Virginia. I mean, you want to talk about a state that has been so decimated by, working in the fossil fuel industry, particularly working with coal. If she had been hammering home universal basic income to basically say, you want to know how you get away from having to work in the coal mines? You have UBI to make sure there is a safe and proper transition into a green infrastructure type situation. Could have been statewide. To me, that would have been one of the better scenarios, where I think pushing that policy could go a very long way. So I actually do think in the Rust Belt in particular, in the Midwestern part of the United States, more candidates pushing for UBI, especially ones that may be looking to primary corporate Democrats, could probably, catch a lot of fire by really getting behind this, what I believe is one of the 3 or 4 signature issues we have in the country right now.
Yeah, and it needs to be seen as, even AOC, she made this mistake when she first started the Green New Deal. And remember when the kind of messaging was leaked that wasn't actually part of the Green New Deal, but it was like a separate thing. And then part of that was she wanted to make sure that people who couldn't work got money. So she was, talking about basic income as being part of the Green New Deal initially, but then she got this huge pushback and started not talking about it anymore because of this framing of, essentially paying people not to work, or, paying people who can't find work. But instead, it's what you need is you're not paying coal miners money because they lost their jobs and now that's all they have. It's that, again, you're providing them money so that they can find new work, that it's always there, that it can take 6 months or a year or whatever to find something, but they don't have to apply for anything. It's never going to be clawed away, so that it's always there in addition to whatever they find. It needs to be seen as bootstraps for all. You're actually lifting everyone up and enabling them to do more. It's not this, all they're getting is that, and it's all they get. There's a difference between a floor and a ceiling. UBI is a floor. It's not at all a ceiling. It's not preventing anyone from anything. It's actually enabling all kinds of things that isn't otherwise possible.
I just think people begrudge people happiness. I think that people look at people and say, nobody deserves something for nothing. Everybody should have to work. I had to work. I had to get me mine. You have to work to get you. And that's really what it is we live in this very individual, not collective, nobody cares. And that's the problem. Because really, this is what makes sense. This is what is logical. This is what is reasonable. This is what would create the collective that would make everything better for all of us. And yet there are people that are arguing about this just because they're hateful, just because they don't like the idea that somebody should be able to exist without toiling away in a coal mine, just because they're a human being. That's really what it is to me, is people just cannot accept that.
I do believe that the message with the right messengers is the key. Politics is really driven by emotion, and that's what gets people to react. I would say, Bernie's biggest flaw as a candidate was that he turned a lot of people off because he wasn't a good presenter. And I do think people like Andrew present much better. And that matters.
Well, Bernie comes off curmudgeonly and grumpy because Bernie is curmudgeonly and grumpy. And Andrew is like a breath of fresh air. And
that does matter. The presentation does matter. And I'm sure you're going to be keeping an eye as we go forward on the type of candidates that are best suited to not only be running, but to be pushing this message, this economic populist message centered around something like UBI that is going to go very, very far. Scott, we really appreciate you coming on. If you have any final thoughts, if there is a way that people can, you know, view your work.
Or are you promoting something? Like, is there
anything
something
like that?
promote?
Absolutely.
You know, what I'll end with is, you know, first of all, I encourage people to follow me on Twitter and to definitely go through my pinned tweet, because there's just a whole list of evidence that I think is great for people to know as far as basic income and unconditional cash goes. But aside from that, I just want to mention too that, you know, we've been talking about basic income and Medicare for all and its importance, and I think at the same time as we're talking about these ideas, that we also have to talk about the structure that makes these ideas possible. And so again, like, I thought it was really important that Andrew ran on ranked choice voting as part of it. And I think that if we're going to really achieve these important policies that we need, we have to actually create the structures and incentives that enable this to actually get done. So, you know, we need some kind of democracy dollars, democracy voucher, you know, HR1 kind of system that gets not necessarily money out of politics, but gets money into the hands of everyone so that they can actually be part of politics, instead of politics being exclusionary and only being for the people who can afford to be a part of it and donate and everything. That's key. We need to create these systems where you don't have these extremists incentivizing to be extremists. You know, like the fact that we're just seeing right now these, you know, what is it, 153 or 4 members of Congress between the House and Senate who are going to be going against the Electoral College results. Like, they're not doing that because they really believe that. They're doing that because they feel that by siding with Trump, that they're going to maintain that base and that they'll be able to win their elections next time around. Like, it's just purely political. And that would not happen if we had like a ranked choice system where you have to get a full majority, because the full majority is not for what they're doing. Their plurality, the active plurality is for that, and that's their base. And that's what we have to get away from. And so we have to focus on these other things as well. They're not as like sexy or exciting, but they're really, really important to actually achieve what we want to achieve.
I don't know. I find ranked choice voting very sexy.
And if that's not enough, New York City is going to have ranked choice voting in the mayoral race. So that is going to be very interesting, because I do think there are 2 very solid candidates running for mayor, obviously Andrew and Diana Morales. Maybe they end up teaming up. You never know. I do think that there's an opportunity in New York right now to have this sort of progressive populist uprising. I do. And I think that the UBI message is a winning message, even if people don't know it yet. And as long as we have people like you, Scott, who are working to continue to push that message forward in a way that people can understand and believe in, I think we're on the right track. And we're very grateful that you came on today.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And thanks for having the conversation.
Same to you, brother. I'm sure we will be in touch. Thank you so much.
After his article comes out.
Indeed. All righty.
Sounds good. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.